In the book of Numbers, Moses' warriors were ordered to slaughter all women and children, except for the virgins. The virgins they got to keep for themselves. These girls were likely between the ages of 9 and 14. Not only did these virgins, 16,000 of them, watch every member of their family get slaughtered, including infants, but they now became property to a brutal Hebrew man soaked in the blood of her brothers and sisters. Do we know why only the virgin girls were allowed to stay alive? Yes, sex. God is essentially a sex enslaver of little girls. These girls were no doubt forced into marriage and sexual relations. Today, we refer to this as sex trafficking and/or rape. All of these young girls were taken into God's encampments to be molested and raped against their consent continually. Rape was not only common in the Bible, it was clearly acceptable. When you go out to war against your enemies and you see among the captives a beautiful woman, and you desire to take her to be your wife, you can bring her home, shave her head, pare her nails, and go in unto her. Women had no choice in marriage or sexual activities. It is very clear that rape was an ordained practice, one that God should have ended, or at least spoken out against. But this God failed to do so, and it required thousands of years of woman's suffrage before the age of secularism finally freed them from bondage. The Bible, prophets, and God had no intent to admonish the acts of depravity against women, or provide them with any equality. How do we know this? Because in the Bible, women were an object to be sold, purchased, and even given away. Even the New Testament book of Matthew has Jesus shedding light on this subject in a parable, whereas the Lord commands one of his servants who is deep in debt to sell his wife and children. Women and children were used by God's chosen people as slaves or objects to be bartered with. These chosen men of God were allowed to keep concubines, sex slaves. In the book of Judges, we find a story where a Hebrew man takes his daughter and a concubine and sends them outside to an angry mob, where they are raped and beat throughout the entire night. At daybreak the following day, the concubine, barely able to walk, returns to her Hebrew master and lays down on the doorstep. Later, he cuts her up into 12 pieces because he was upset with how poorly she had been treated by his brethren. In Genesis, we find another very similar story about a man of God named Lot and his 2 daughters. Lot went outside and said, "My friends, don't do this wicked thing. Look, I have 2 daughters who have never slept with a man. Let me bring them out to you, and you can do what you like with them. But don't do anything to these men, for they have come under the protection of my roof." Were not his own daughters under the protection of his roof? These passages paint a clear picture of what it was like being a woman in this Abrahamic faith. Many women ended up raped, sold, and bargained off because they no longer held their virginity, therefore no value within God's glorious society. These women could not find husbands to take care of them because they lost their virginity to no fault of their own. This God showed no empathy or mercy to this injustice. Slavery was an acceptable practice, and nowhere in the Old or New Testament does God speak out against these cruel activities. And when the Lord your God delivers the enemy into your hands, ye shall strike every male in it with the edge of the sword, but the women, the little ones, and all that is in the city ye shall plunder for yourself. Women and children were nothing more than objects to be owned and plundered. Many Bible verses reveal the lesser value placed on women among the Abrahamic faith. In Leviticus, we discover that a penalty is placed on any child that is born a female. A woman who gives birth to a male child is unclean for 7 days, but 14 days if the child is female. The Bible's legal status of a woman was far inferior to that of a man, and his wife or daughters were among his possessions which he could sell or trade. One of the biggest problems for women in this particular religious group is that all Abrahamic faiths blame women for the problems of mankind. In the Old Testament we read, "Of the woman came the beginning of sin, and through her we all die." In the New Testament, this sentiment continues firm. "But I suffer not a woman to teach, nor to usurp authority over the man, but to be in silence." And contrary to popular apologetics, this author actually tells you why women are not allowed to speak. "For Adam was first formed, then Eve. And Adam was not deceived, but the woman being deceived was in the transgression." Women were placed with blame. The New Testament sets up a framework for women to be easily controlled or abused. "Wives, submit yourselves unto your husbands, for the husband is the head of the wife. Let your women keep silent in the churches, for it is not permitted unto them to speak, but they are commanded to be under obedience, as also saith the law. And if they will learn anything, let them ask their husbands at home, for it is a shame for women to speak in the church." The New Testament also instructs women not to braid their hair or to wear jewelry. Every woman should have her head covered when she prays, or she should have her head shaved. 1 Corinthians makes this clear by saying, "For a man ought not to cover his head, since he is the image and glory of God." Christian apologists have fabricated a completely false narrative for these verses by saying that it is because women were being unruly and shouting during church meetings. This is an embarrassingly poor apologetic that tries to rewire these verses to mean something other than what they clearly say, and it is not at all what any of these verses are implying. To this day, it amazes me that any woman could hold even a shred of respect for these misogynist books. I would be ashamed if my daughter defended the Bible's treatment of women in both the Old and New Testaments. During the woman's suffrage in 1897, which was a huge social push to make the rights of women more equal to men, one of the major activists for women's rights, Elizabeth Stanton, said, "In the early days of woman suffrage, I saw that the greatest obstacle we had to overcome was the Bible. It was hurled at us on every side." It should be overwhelmingly clear that the God of the Bible made no attempt to relieve women from a place of abuse and suffering, as if this God and the holy books were man-made and catered only to men. An American journalist, Counter-apologetic, said, "When you consider that God could have commanded anything he wanted, the 10 Commandments have got to rank as one of the great missed moral opportunities of all time. How different history would have been had he clearly and unmistakably forbidden war, tyranny, slavery, cruelty to children, wife-beating, stoning, treating women or anyone as chattel or inferior beings. If you missed part 1 of this Evil God trilogy, we examined God's cruelty towards children. And in part 3, we will examine God's lust for violence and blood. Stay strong and wise, my friends.
I don't believe in masquerades. I don't believe that you're okay. I don't believe that God will save. Only you can solve your problems.